Mrs. Monroe lived in Darlington, Maryland. She was the mother of 8 children. She came home one night from the grocery store. She walked in the house and it was eerily quiet. She looked around. Everything looked like it was pretty normal. And finally, she goes into the living room and she sees 5 of her little ones sitting around in a circle, and they were playing with something. So she goes into the kitchen, she puts down her groceries, and then she walks into the living room to see what the kids are doing. She immediately became terrified because she saw 5 children playing with 5 of the cutest skunks you could ever find. Now, this made her yell, "Run, children, run!" So the kids, of course, each picked up a skunk and took off. Well, they take off in 5 different directions, and she's standing there getting even more terrified because now they each have one of the skunks in their hands. And so she starts yelling even louder, and she finally got to the point where she scared the children. When she scared the children, they squeezed the skunks, and you guessed it. Fear. You know, we've all experienced fear at some point in our life. And we deal with it differently, of course, depending on what it is and our emotions at the moment. But how we respond to fear has great implications on our life. Mrs. Monroe's fear became reality because of the way she responded and what happened there. The 5 children with 5 skunks, it's no real surprise that you would respond differently. However, it did have a bad result. Fear can lead to worry. Worry sometimes paralyzes us and keeps us from doing anything at all. In extremes, worry starts to deplete your morale. Worry can have a negative effect on your health, and taken to an extreme can cause depression, and then even to the point of suicide. Today in our country, there's a lot of fear. Part of it's because of COVID-19. Some of it is the anarchy in the streets in some of our cities. And for some, it's also the concern about the outcome of the election in November and the implications of that on the country or our futures. Stress levels are definitely up. We've experienced panic buying in our grocery stores. Some people are afraid to even get in touch with anybody else because of fear of catching the COVID-19 virus. In the midst of, or in some cities, some citizens really can't even get out and take a walk around their block and feel safe. In the midst of that unrest, there's a movement to defund police and to have less of them on the street to even make it as safe as possible. I read an article this week about the Nestle CEO, Mark Schneider. Since this COVID-19 thing hit, he's worked in his office every day to try to make sure that the thousands of employees that work for Nestle can go to work safely every day. 66% of finance professionals say they have a higher stress level now because of COVID-19. No surprise in that most of them deal with cash flow. And if your business is closed, cash flow is an issue. A great number of those financial professionals are working either longer hours or not getting any sleep, or maybe both. Many people have lost their jobs, and some of those people are concerned about losing their house. Some of those closed businesses will never open again. Where do we turn when we figure it out that we're no longer in control of our circumstances or our future. I trust that through this lesson, you're going to be reminded that God's in control, even when we can't tell it. God is with you, and he will not forsake you. And our calling and our vision to be the church here at Grace Church has not been rescinded. We still have work to do. Let's look at a biblical example of how one man dealt with a situation like we're talking about. Open your Bibles and turn to Daniel chapter 2. And we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 5 in just a moment. After the Babylonian king overtook Jerusalem in about 605 BC, Daniel became one of the first deported peoples that were taken back to Babylon. And upon arrival, he was deemed to be an individual that could go to work in the king's court. And so that's what he was doing. Sometime later, the situation we're going to read about here, Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 to 5, happened. The wise men of the king's council were called together. And so, Barb, we're ready for that. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell them what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, "I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means." The astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we'll interpret it." The king replied to the astrologers, "This is what I've firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble." Now that would pucker you up a little bit, wouldn't it? The wise men were soon forced to admit in Daniel chapter 2, verses 10 and 11, the astrologers answered to the king, "There is not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men." Well, they're in a bad place, and the king is not any too happy. The king was so angry that he ordered the execution of the wise men, and then Daniel and his friends were sought out to be included with the wise men in this execution. So the king's guard approaches Daniel and says, "Look, you're needed." He explained the situation, told Daniel he was about to be executed. Now, Daniel is now in a position that none of us would like to be in, right? We're about to be executed because somebody else was asked a question and they couldn't answer it. And by the way, it's not an easy question to answer. So he's in a tough situation, but look at the difference in the way that Daniel responded to this situation. It would be very understandable for Daniel to be scared or afraid, to be worried, or to be stressed by these circumstances. But what Daniel does in verses 14 and 16, first Daniel speaks to the commander of the king's guard, but he speaks to him with wisdom and tact. He doesn't get emotional. He doesn't just become unreasonable about his approach. He just speaks to him with wisdom and tact. He convinces the king's commander to give him an audience with the king. And so he gets an audience with the king. He talks to the king and he says, King, give me some time and I'll get you your answer. Now, that's confidence in your relationship to God, is it not? That's confidence. So after the king granted the time, Daniel went to his friends. We know the three friends. And he explained the matter to them so that they would understand it. And he urged them to pray with him that God would give them the dream and the interpretation. Now, why would Daniel respond like that? What is it that makes you so calm and able to do that in the midst of so difficult a circumstance? He didn't say it was too hard. He didn't say it was unfair. He didn't say it's unreasonable. He didn't even claim it was too difficult. He did not talk about the gods because he knew they couldn't help. But he knew that there was one living God that could. Daniel may have remembered Isaiah chapters 4 through 5, or chapter 46, verses 4 to 5, which hopefully is on the screen there for you. Even in your old age and gray hairs, I am he. I am he who will sustain you. This is, of course, God speaking to Israel, or to the Jews. I have made you, and I will carry you. I will sustain you, and I will rescue you. To whom will you compare me or count me equal? To whom will you liken me that we may be compared? You know, unlike helpless idols or the gods or dead prophets or false teachers, the living God may be approached by us at any time with any of the concerns that we have in our life. And we can depend upon him to assist us when we approach him in dealing with those things that are our fears. I have occasionally those situations where I wake up in the middle of the night and I've got this fear about something or my concern about what something's going to be. And it's amazing how often when I stop and just pray to the Lord to just help me deal with this situation, and then I find myself waking up just before the alarm goes off. But it's only the peace that God gives in those moments that help you to get through those things. Daniel did, and we serve a God. And I look around the room, and I can say this because my hair is also gray. Even in our old age, when our strength is not quite what it used to be, God tells us that he will sustain us. We can trust him. God made us. God made us, and God has invited us into his kingdom, and he loves us. And so we can count on him. He tells us he'll carry us and sustain us and rescue us when we're in situations where we need. There's nobody to be compared with God. No, there's no comparison for anyone in the world. We serve a living, holy, wonderful God. And sometimes we just need to trust in that, like Daniel did here. Now, Daniel may also have been thinking about a few verses later in chapter 46 of Isaiah, verses 9 through 11. God says, I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. And that is true. I have made known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. I say, my purpose will stand, and I will do what I please. From the east I summon a bird of prey, from far off land, a man to fulfill my purpose. What I have said, that will I bring about. What I have planned, that will I do. You know, there is no one like God. He's all powerful. He can do what he wants to do. He's all knowing. He knows everything, and he's everywhere. How can you beat that? Who else could have parted the Red Sea just in time for the Israelites to get away during the Exodus? And who else could have brought the sea down at just the right time to protect them from the invading army? Only God. Before events unfold, God is able to make them known. Have you ever marveled at the fact that Jesus, or that God in the Bible put all these prophecies about Jesus' coming? He's telling his people to look for this Messiah, but he's also telling his enemy to look for this Messiah. He's putting it in writing. Can you imagine being the army general and telling your opponent what you're going to do and when you're going to do it? Well, not exactly when, maybe, but what you're going to do, and let them know what that is, and then still be able to accomplish what you set out to do? God did that. He told his enemy what he was going to do, and he made it happen, just like he said. God's purpose will stand. Psalm 135, verses 6 and 7, and we'll talk about verse 14 there as well, kind of reiterates this point. God does whatever pleases him in the heavens and on the earth, in the seas and all their depths. He makes clouds arise from the ends of the earth. He sends lightning with rain and brings out the wind from its storehouses. And I like what he says in verse 14 there, because this should be an encouragement to each and every one of us. For the Lord will vindicate his people and have compassion on his servants. That's the God that you and I are worshiping. He will do what he pleases. No one is able to thwart God's plans. And what he has planned, he's able to do it, and he's going to do it. Daniel was close enough to God to know that he could trust him with his circumstances. He had faith that God would respond during his time of need. Another clue as to Daniel's trust that he demonstrated at that moment may come from his prayer at the end of that passage in Daniel, where he praises God for the answer now that he's got it. So if you're still in Daniel, look at verses 20 through 23. Daniel chapter 2, 20 through 23. Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and he deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. He starts off by talking about God's wisdom and his power, as we've spoke about already. And then he goes in and he refers to the fact that God actually could make the sun stand still, like he did back in Joshua's days. And the seasons change because God makes them change. So he's referring to all the power that God has over us. And then we come to the passage that is kind of the title of today's message. While man attempts to influence who will be in charge in various things, God is a king breaker and a king maker. And so I want to share with you a story from Scripture of one of those times when God was both a king breaker and a king maker at the same time. In 2 Kings chapter 18 and 19 tells the story of King and I hope this is correct because I'm going to incorrectly pronounce it if it's wrong the whole time. King Sennacherib of Assyria is getting ready to attack Judah. This is at the time of King Hezekiah. And so Assyria had already conquered Israel, the northern kingdom, in 722 BC. This is about 700 BC, that they're getting ready to attack Jerusalem. The king of Assyria has already conquered 46 cities in Judah, in the southern kingdom, and now he's laid siege on Jerusalem, and he's threatening the king and the people there, and he wants to take it over. Second Chronicles also refers to this whole thing, and so I want to share one of the passages from Second Chronicles chapter 32, verses 7 and 8, because this tells you who King Hezekiah was and how his faith really encouraged the people as well. So we've got this large army that's sitting outside of Jerusalem, threatening the city. And King Hezekiah goes before the people, and he says this: "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of the king of Assyria and the vast army with him." Isn't it interesting? He makes the point that it's a vast army instead of just saying that small little place, He points out the reality. It's a vast army. "For there is a greater power with us than with him. With him is only the arm of flesh, but with us, the Lord our God, to help us and to fight our battles." Faith. There you go. There's faith. And the people gained confidence from what Hezekiah, the king of Judah, said. Well, hey, aren't you glad to have a leader like that when in a situation like that? King Sennacherib's officers then approached the walls of Jerusalem because they weren't willing to give this up and walk away. They still wanted to conquer these people. So they approach the walls and they start speaking in Hebrew and telling the people, don't listen to your king. Your king doesn't know what he's talking about. They go on and they tell him, look at all the gods of all these people we've already conquered. And they go through a list of the peoples, and they name the names of the kings that they've conquered and destroyed along the way. And they say, has the God of any nation ever delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Clearly putting the king of Assyria above all the gods. Where are the gods of the people we have conquered? And of course, the inference is, where's your God? Because he'll have no power like all these others did. Well, this caused King Hezekiah to tear his clothes, to put on sackcloth and begin to pray. He received a message from Isaiah soon after that said King Sennacherib would hear a report and he would return to his home. And when he got home, God was going to have him put to death by the sword. Now, there's a prophet for you, giving you some specifics of what's going on. Soon, King Sennacherib received a report that the king of Egypt had pulled his armies together, and he was coming after King Sennacherib, marching out to fight him. Well, this forced King Sennacherib to give it one last shot at the king of Jerusalem before he had to turn his attention on another army coming after him. And so he took the time to draft up a letter and send a letter to King Hezekiah. This letter threatened the complete destruction of Israel and, of course, his life as king. And again, he cites the examples of other nations that he's conquered, and he points out that there's a number of other kings that are no longer walking this earth because of the attack. And so he compares, again, the gods of those nations to the God that Hezekiah is trusting, and indicating that he should not put his trust in those kings. He should put his trust in King Sennacherib to surrender, and King Sennacherib would let them live. King Hezekiah is not your average king, however. He knows who he serves. So he took the letter with him to the altar, and he prayed to God. And 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 19, or chapter 19, verse 19, gives a portion of that prayer. Now, O Lord our God, deliver us from this hand, so that all kingdoms on earth may know that you alone, O Lord, are God. Now, that testimony is good up to today, is it not? Because these are things that God has made happen to help us to increase our faith when we find ourselves in a situation where we're worried or have fear or concern about what's going on. Isaiah prophesied about King Sennacherib's fall again after that prayer. And that very night, the angel of the Lord slew 185,000 soldiers. Guess what King Sennacherib did then? He retreated. He decided it was time to go off. He found out who the real God is, and he took off. Well, he broke camp. He went home. Sometime later, he was in his own temple, worshiping his god, Nisroch, when his sons came in and with a sword slayed him, just as it was prophesied by Isaiah that it would happen. God is a king breaker. He broke that king. He took away his crown. But you know what? He's also a king maker. And I want to highlight with you what 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 5 to 7 says about King Hezekiah. Let's look at that for a moment. Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. He held fast to the Lord and did not cease to follow him. He kept the commands of the Lord had given Moses, and the Lord was with him. He was successful in whatever he undertook. Wouldn't you love to have that said about you? I'd love to have that said about me. Not necessarily be king. I don't think I want to be king, but just to be able to say that would be wonderful. Referring back to Daniel chapter 2, verses 20 and through 22, Daniel also noted that God gives wisdom and knowledge, which he did to Hezekiah, which he did to Daniel in terms of how to respond in a circumstance that some of us wouldn't know how to handle. Or we might only know how to handle it when God needed to give us the grace to do it, right? As expected, God answered Daniel's prayer and his friend's prayer. God knows exactly where we're headed today. You and I don't know. There's a lot of stuff that we are still trying to work out. There's a lot of things we still think about. But you know what? God is still in control. He was in control then. He's still in control today. Even if we don't know that he's in control, he is there. He is. And God is able to carry you, to sustain you, and to rescue you at the time that you need it, when you'll trust in him and let him do it. You know, as we learn about God's power and God's goodness, it's possible for us to learn another step in our walk with the Lord. Let's look at Isaiah chapter 12 and verse 2. Surely God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. You know, our proper understanding of God's power and his goodness leads us to the position, as it says here, that we can trust God. Trust him. We can believe that everything will work together for good for us because we know who we serve and we know God's goodness. Then once we trust him, we can overcome our fears and our worries and our concerns. The Lord becomes our strength to get us through the tribulations that we're going to have to face. Then our hearts can sing a song of praise and glory to God's faithfulness. After that, Isaiah chapter 12, verses 4-6 challenges us further, which is particularly appropriate to us here at Grace Church today. It challenges us to give thanks to God and let it be known to the nations what God has done, and that we give God the glory and the honor that he deserves for the things that he's done. Isaiah 12, verses 4-6. In that day you will say, give thanks to the Lord, call on his name, make known among the nations what he has done, and proclaim that his name is exalted. Sing to the Lord, for he has done glorious things. Let this be known to all the world. Shout aloud and sing for joy, people of Zion, for great is the Holy One of Israel among you. You know, despite this COVID-19 shutdown, changes in our church staff, the church grace vision has not changed. We still have a role to do. And coming up on the board here is a summary of our vision statement. You know, we envision at Grace Church a church where people are loving the Lord and loving our neighbors. We envision a place where our lives are being transformed by the Holy Spirit into the image of Christ. And we need to continue to work with that. That we share God's love to all generations in our church, which is an important aspect of where we want to go. And then finally, of course, to impact the world with the life-changing message of Jesus Christ. You know, if every American had the level of faith that Daniel or King Hezekiah had in the situations that they faced, we wouldn't be nearly in the positions that we've seen in these last few months. You know, it's probably a lot to ask for that many people to have that much faith, but nevertheless, we would be better, would we not? In conclusion, a wise man once told a young husband, "You thought you were in control? You were never in control. You just thought you were." Well, that applies not only to the husband, but to the wife as well, right? We were never in control. God never told us we were in control. But God is not surprised by anything that's going on in the world today. You can believe that God is managing it to attain his purposes. Some of those purposes we don't know. Some of those purposes we may have to learn about someday. While we play chess on a board game with kings and queens and knights, God's playing chess with nations and real kings. and he's making them do what he wants them to do. Despite the fact that God gives them the freedom, the free will to make their choices, God is still directing what they're doing in his sovereignty. Sometimes it may seem like Satan is winning some of these battles, but I encourage you to wait to the end of the book and look back and see that God was in control the whole time. He was never out of control. He was never surprised by the things that were coming on. He was there. You know, as a Christian, God is with you. He's carrying, sustaining, and he's rescuing you. He never promised us a trouble-free walk after we accepted him. He has promised to be with us through our walk, however. And I might also remind you at this point what James said in James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. And I know this is like fingernails when you have to hear fingernails on a board when you have to hear it. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work in you so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If I can borrow from the U.S. Army ad of the past, God may be using that trial to make you all that you can be. You know, God is developing us for eternity. And there are certain things that we all need to know and understand about what that is. And so sometimes these trials that we do individually face are all about building our faith and developing us so that we can be all that we can be. Just like a Hezekiah who had a job to do, Grace Church has a job to do. Hezekiah was to lead Jerusalem away from the idols, the sacred stones, the bronze snakes, the things that were going on at that time, and to focus their attention on God. Likewise, Grace Church has been given a vision and a mission to carry out. Let's not be distracted or divided by the fears that have beset our nation. Let's hold fast to the Lord, never cease to follow God, and carry out our responsibilities to love the Lord and our neighbors, to be transformed more and more in our life to the image of Christ, to share God's love to all the generations of our church, and to share the faithfulness and love of God to a world that is seeking hope for their future.